problem is that the danger is now. And were conflict to break out, you come to any fight with what you've got. So if a re-elected President Trump were to put a bit of pressure on us to back our rhetoric with deeds, I don't think that would be a bad thing.
Australia is the greatest nation on earth. And at the referendum last year, Australians told the elites they want to keep it that way. Is 2024 the year mainstream Australians continue to secure our way of life, or will the elites strike back? In Season 3 of Australia's Future, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott will share his unique insight on the future of the Australian way of life.
Well, hello Tony, and g'day to all of our listeners. Great to be back for another episode of Australia's Future with Tony Abbott. Today we will be discussing the election season in the US, France, the UK, and also providing an assessment of the domestic situation here in Australia. Tony, great to be back with you.
Dan, lovely to be with you too.
All right, well, it's election. So let's kick off, I think, with the most significant and consequential, which is, of course, in the US. We've had the debate recently between Trump and Biden. It was a disaster for Biden, basically. There's questions about his ongoing candidacy and whether he will need to step aside or not. But more important than that is what this actually shows about the leadership or lack thereof in the United States and what that means for the Western world. So, Tony, to kick off, perhaps you could give us your headline observations about the situation in the US.
Well, the first thing, Dan, I'd like to say is that whoever is the President of the United States is the leader of the free world. And I've tried to make it my business, even as an ex-PM, not to be publicly critical of the leader of the free world. Whatever President Biden's faults, he is our president too, because all of us in the democracies depend upon American leadership for our ongoing freedom and ultimately our prosperity too. So that's the first point to make. The second point to make is politics is rarely a contest between good and great. It's often not even a contest between good and bad. Sometimes it's a contest between bad and worse, but we can't avoid the choice. I'm a conservative. If I were voting in the United States, I would vote for the conservative candidate. I don't say that Donald Trump is the greatest possible candidate. I think he was, on balance, quite a good president. I think that on balance, he was a man of considerable political integrity. He said he would build the wall. He gave it a red-hot go. He said he'd move the embassy to Jerusalem. He did. He said he'd pull out of Paris. He did. He said he'd boost defence and cut taxes. He did. So in that respect, at least, I think he was a good president. And I like to think, should he become president again, that he would be better a second time round, because even though he obviously is a rather headstrong individual, a rather proud individual, nevertheless, he's obviously quite a smart individual, and smart people do tend to learn from their mistakes. And there were strengths and weaknesses in his first term. Let's hope if there's a second term, there are more strengths and fewer weaknesses.
Well, I certainly admire his tenacity to keep going because everything's been thrown at him and he's still there. Just interested in your perspective, specifically on the Biden situation. I know you may not want to opine on some of the day-to-day political elements of it, but it was interesting watching the debate on CNN. The panel straight after was immediately running the lines from the Democratic establishment that Biden's got to go. Now, that's not an easy thing to do because he's got the delegates because there was no primary. He's got 95% of the delegates. So basically he'd have to agree to step down and allow free his delegates to go to somebody else. So it's not straightforward. Do you think he's going to be the candidate, or how do you think the Democrats should handle this situation?
Well, look, I had quite a good conversation with President Biden back in 2012, and back then he was a very impressive individual. He was, if you like, the Democrats' version of John McCain, intelligent, folksy, genial, insightful, all of those things. Now, the argument is that he's past his prime. Even he admits the other day that he doesn't debate as well, he doesn't speak as well, he doesn't walk as well as he used to, going into the 2020 campaign, his aide said that he didn't do cognitive fastball. Well, I think it would be better if we had as our president someone who was at the top of his game. But look, in the end, this is a matter for the president and his party. And I just hope that whatever decision they make, it genuinely is a decision that puts the party and the country first.
In terms of what this means for Australia, so if we start with a potential Trump presidency, I think there'll be good and bad elements or challenging elements. I think Trump will take us to task on defence. He will probably demand that we spend more and spend better and make a bigger contribution, which is probably fair enough.
Yep.
There's the tariffs, which he said he's going to put on. Presumably that will affect us. We may be able to get out of it, but presumably that's going to affect us. So that'll create a challenge. But on the positive side, I think when he was president, Trump really opened debate. He was very anti-political correctness. He was unapologetic in his defence of the US and of Western values, which I think helped Conservatives in Australia to have a bit more space to engage in debate. So, but just interested in your thoughts on what a Trump presidency could mean for us.
Look, I think they're good points you make, Dan, and I think you've got it pretty much to rights. Certainly, I would expect a President Trump Mark II to be tougher on our relative defence indolence. I mean, we see today that we're making a microscopic contribution to the vital biannual RIMPAC naval exercise. Our contribution this time is about a quarter of what it was just 2 years ago, and that's because for all the current government's talk of AUKUS submarines and future frigates and so on, whatever might be happening in the long term, in the short term, we're running down our defences, and the problem is that the danger is now. And were conflict to break out, and we've seen in Ukraine and in the Middle East that conflict can break out very, very quickly indeed. You come to any fight with what you've got, not with what you would like to have or what you might have in 6 months, 12 months or a decade's time. So if a re-elected President Trump were to put a bit of pressure on us to back our rhetoric with deeds, I don't think that would be a bad thing.
All right, well, let's turn to the French election, which has been fascinating. Just for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, there's a bit of a different approach in France. Most people would be familiar with the presidential election, which has the two processes, the first and the second runoff. Well, the election over the National Assembly is similar in the sense that there's 577 seats in their assembly. In constituencies where no candidate won an outright majority in the first round, the top two candidates then proceed to the second round, plus any candidate that got 12.5% or more. So it's a two-stage process. In the first round, the National Front or National Rally, as they now know, 33% of the vote, which was the highest by a very long way. It's their most significant vote. So just going back even just 2 years ago, they had 18%, up to 33% now. So they've skyrocketed. And they've performed very strongly. Macron has plummeted down the polls, or his party has plummeted. So we are seeing a very significant shift of the voting base to the right, I think fueled by concerns about migration and concerns about culture and a lack of leadership. Very interested in your perspective, Tony, of what's happening in France and perhaps on continental Europe.
Well, I suppose 3 points. The first point I want to make is that the French system is more like the American system than our own or the British system, in that there is a sharp division between the executive and the legislative branches. Most of the executive authority rests with the president. So even if there is a right-wing majority in the National Assembly, that doesn't mean that government is going to change that much. And to the extent that it does change, it would probably be more paralytic rather than stronger. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that the ultimate result for the National Assembly will depend very much upon whether the forces of the left can coalesce so that it's only one leftist candidate against the National Front or National Rally candidate, and at the moment there's uncertainty whether that will be the case. The final point I want to make is that the growth of the National Rally or National Front has really been mostly at the expense of the traditional centre-right party, the Gaullists, who have dropped from roughly a third, 2/5 of the vote a decade or so back to scarcely 10% of the vote now. And this is what happens when respectable, in inverted commas, centre-right parties are unrepresentative of their voting base, that don't respond to the concerns of their voting base. Now, conservative working and middle-class French people have been very anxious for many years now about the impact of uncontrolled, often illegal migration, the impact on social cohesion, the impact on housing, the impact on jobs and infrastructure. But the official consensus, both amongst the left and the establishment right, has been to ignore these concerns. Now, in a democracy, if widely held concerns are simply ignored, eventually there will be a breakout, and that's what reform in Britain is, and that's what the much better established and longer lasting National Rally is in France. It's a reaction to the fact that the established centre-right parties did not adequately represent the concerns of their voting base. And this is why it's so important that political leaders stay in touch with the street. Now, sometimes you've got to persuade the street that the street's misguided, but what you can't do is just ignore the street. You've got to work out whether the street is right, and to that extent change your policy. And if the street is wrong, you've got to persuade them and bring them back to something more sensible. And in France and in Britain, the mainstream Conservatives have failed to do that, and that's why they're in so much trouble.
Yeah, well, let's move on to the UK. So we talked about this last time, and I think there was a lot of interest in your observations and what you had to say about the UK situation. Now, their election is now only a few days away, and it looks increasingly the case, as we suspected, that Labor is going to win in a very big way. So you gave us your pitch basically to, even if you're unhappy with the Conservatives and even if you like Nigel and reform, you should stick with the Conservatives because a Labor government will be disastrous. Perhaps you could elaborate on your concerns about a Labor government and what that could mean for the UK.
Well, that certainly was my pitch to you a fortnight ago, Dan, and to our listeners a fortnight ago. And earlier it was the same pitch in Britain when I was there. But it doesn't seem like the electors are heeding the cries of people like myself to stick with the Conservatives because they're better than the alternative. They're better than the only electable alternative. So, look, I hope I'm wrong. I really do hope I'm wrong. And the Blair government, at least on foreign policy issues, was a very robust government. Let's hope the Starmer government is much more like Blair than like Corbyn. My fear is that Keir Starmer was an enthusiastic backer of Jeremy Corbyn just 5 years ago, and I worry that someone who was an enthusiast for Corbyn, who was pro-IRA, pro-dictatorship, anti the British nuclear deterrent and so on, I fear that someone who was all for Corbyn just 5 years ago is going to be pretty weak when it comes to the struggles of the wider world right now. As I said, I hope I'm wrong. I hope this guy turns out to be more Blair than Corbyn, but it's hard not to be a little despondent. The British Labor Party, like the Labor Party here, has moved a long way from its working class roots. It's very much a green left party. It's a green left party with, if you like, a Gaza fringe, as we saw in the local government elections not long ago. And I think this will be a very problematic government, and I think it ushers in a period of great uncertainty for Britain. And given that Britain, after the United States, is the most important country in the Western world, given that Britain is, if you like, the source of so much that has made the modern world, the mother of parliaments, the world's common language, the Industrial Revolution, the emancipation of minorities, given that British soft power is still so vast, a weak Britain tends to mean a weak democratic world as well.
And we were just discussing just before we went to air, Keir Starmer seems to be doing very much what Albanese did in the lead up to the 2022 election, whereas he hid his radical stripes, was basically seemed to be someone who was relatively inoffensive, nothing to be scared about, not a threat. But we know that he's much more Whitlam than Hawke. And I fear that you're right about Keir Starmer would be much more Corbyn than Blair.
That's my worry, and you're right. The Starmer playbook seems to be a direct lift from the Albanese playbook. Anthony Albanese, not a bad human being, genuine patriot, wants the best thing for our country, but by a certain set of values. Those values are very much of the Green left, and that seems to be Keir Starmer's approach as well. Don't scare the horses, promise to be safe change. We're not a radical party, we're a competent party. We'll avoid the ineptitude of the Conservatives. Well, that's what they say before the election. After the election, all change.
Yeah, well, we saw that with Kevin Rudd.
Yeah.
I'm John Howard Light. I'm an economic conservative. Albanese, you're right, it happens time and time again. You mentioned that Albanese is someone who's patriotic or someone who has and I'm sure you're right. I've never had any personal interaction with him, but I got to say one thing that irks me is why can't he stand in front of the Australian flag? It's always the three flags, and I have no problem with the Indigenous flag and the Torres Strait Islander flag. They have an important part in our culture, but I would have thought on official business where you're representing our nation as the Prime Minister, why can't you just stand in front of the Australian flag? I don't
Well, this is a very good point, Dan. And look, I've made this point before. The national flag represents all of us. The Indigenous flags represent some of us. And I think it's wrong in principle to fly the flags of some of us co-equally with the flag of all of us. I just think it's wrong in principle, and I really hope that this changes quickly. I can't imagine that it's going to change under the current government, but I'd be optimistic that it would be one of the first things that would change if there were a change of government.
Well, I think it needs to, and I think a lot of people are pretty sick of it. Okay, so we'll just stay on the domestic situation. So what we've seen over the last couple of weeks, the debate over nuclear power, I think has gotten more salient and more developed. Perhaps some worrying signs for the coalition in the polling, where it doesn't appear that the majority of Australians are energised by their policy. It's been put to me that perhaps one of those reasons is it is maybe a good idea and certainly something that should be done, but it is a decade hence and we have a real problem right now. So maybe voters are looking for, okay, well, what would a Dutton government do on day one to fix the energy system, among other matters? But just interested in your views on that debate and maybe the broader situation as well.
Well, Dan, look, any politician who does something which is genuinely groundbreaking, that is genuinely courageous, which is novel, if you like, is going to generate, initially at least, a degree of bafflement. And I am all in favour of what Peter Dutton has done, and I think in doing it, he has demonstrated that he really does have the character and the political integrity to be a great Prime Minister. I think Peter Dutton has the capability of being John Howard Mark II, should he win, one of our really great Prime Ministers. But you're right, nuclear is only part of our energy future, and even if we made the decision to go nuclear tomorrow, it would be the best part of a decade before we actually generated nuclear power. And we need change now, not just in 10 years' time. I'm confident that what we will see in coming weeks and months is more emphasis on the other elements of the coalition's energy policy. And we've got not just to end the nuclear ban, but we've got to stop coal-fired power stations closing until there's a reliable alternative. And we've got to get a lot more gas out of the ground quickly, because you cannot sustain a system with a large penetration of renewables without gas, which is the obvious way to keep the lights on when the wind drops and the sun disappears. So I think the coalition has all the elements of a successful policy there. It's just that the focus has been on nuclear over the last couple of weeks, understandably, because that's, if you like, the dramatic new announcement. We're going to have up to 7 nuclear power stations on old coal-fired power station sites. But there's a lot else there as well which hasn't been stressed and which needs to be stressed in the weeks ahead, because people want to know, are their lights going to stay on, and are their bills going to stop going up in the short term, not just in the long term. Now, there is absolutely no doubt that this government is telling bare-faced lies. I mean, sure, wind and solar power is cheap when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. But what you've got to look at, as the IPA through Professor Stephen Wilson has been saying in an excellent paper, what you've got to look at is not just the incremental cost of different forms of power. You've got to look at the total system cost.
The poles and wires.
The total system cost. And with wind and solar, it's not just the cost of the actual power generated, it's the cost of the backup, because you always need backup. It's the cost of all the poles and wires, because you need to sort of double or triple the number of poles and wires you've got. And it's the cost of systemic changes, because our current system is based on synchronous power, and wind and solar needs to go through various transformers before it can go into the system. So that's why the total system costs of wind and solar are massive. And over time, the cheapest form of emissions-free power is definitely nuclear, as Dr. A.D. Patterson, the former head of ANSTO, which runs our Lucas Heights nuclear reactor, has been pointing out. I mean, Dr. A.D. Patterson keeps saying, look, we are being conned, absolutely conned, by these constant government claims that wind and solar is cheap, because it's only cheap at the point of generation. It's not cheap at the point of delivery. And that's what people are paying for, not just the generation, but the delivery.
Well, that's right. I mean, and what Stephen Wilson's paper found is that a system of renewables is about 4 times as expensive as the basic current system as we have, and probably double that of a nuclear-powered system. We do a lot of events with IPA members across the country, and one of the things that's sort of put to me, and I want to sort of ask you this, is nuclear sometimes feels like a bit of a square peg in a round hole. Yes, of course, we should get rid of the ban on nuclear and pursue nuclear where it makes sense to do so. But wouldn't it have just been easier to ditch net zero and maintain the coal-fired power fleet? Because one of the reasons we don't have nuclear is obviously the ban, but also we've got coal. We've got good, cheap coal, and we've been using that. Now, I understand when you talk to politicians, they say, well, coal's not popular, people don't like it. And I get that, but it sort of sometimes feels that the coalition felt that they had to do nuclear because they wanted to keep net zero. They didn't want to take Labor's policy, and so they were left with nuclear as kind of the only option that's available. What do you think about that observation that's been made by some people?
Well, I think in my book Battle Lines, which might be on this set somewhere.
Right there, right behind you there.
I said that if we really do have to get emissions down far and fast, we are going to have to look at nuclear energy. And that was published, as you'd remember, back in 2009, Dan. So look, if emissions reduction is an important national objective, nuclear power is essential, no doubt about that. But Peter Dutton, to his credit, has said that he is not committed to Labor's 2030 emissions reduction targets.
Yep.
And Labor's completely unrealistic 82% renewables target, legislated target by 2030, because it's completely unachievable. It's completely unachievable, and he's right. So, look, you might say that a bolder coalition might have dropped the net zero target. Certainly back when it was announced under Scott Morrison, if my counsel had been sought, I would have urged caution. But it's a commitment that's been made, and this is one of the reasons why you should be very careful about making big commitments in public life, because once you've made them, they're very hard to unmake. Look at the commitment that John Howard made back in late 2007 for constitutional recognition of Indigenous people. Now, if we go back to that time, this was essentially a political alternative to Kevin Rudd's apology. The trouble was it didn't turn out to be an alternative to the apology. It turned out to be an addition to the apology. And it turned out to be one of those things that was easy to agree in principle, but almost impossible to agree in practice, as we found out last year. Now, thank God the Voice was defeated, because it was a disastrous proposal. But strictly speaking, we are all still committed to constitutional recognition. The only form of constitutional recognition that I would personally be comfortable with is something like an amendment to the preamble to state that this indivisible federal commonwealth of ours under the Crown has an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation and an immigrant character. But as we know, the Indigenous activist class would never accept something as modest as that. They wanted a power grab. So we're stuck.
Well, Tony, I think that's a good place to end. So thank you very much for your time. I know you've got to head off to the airport to catch a plane, so we appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule for these conversations, and we'll talk after the French election and after the UK election, and we'll be interested to see what your thoughts are.
And Dan, events like this are not a distraction from my busy schedule. They are my schedule. Very important, these conversations that we have.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tony, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Good on you, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.